Hi, good morning, everyone. We have an incredible panel talking about AI and automation in the cultured meat space. Definitely we'll probably lean into AI a bit more, but we have some very esteemed people up on this stage who can also specify the difference, like what really is AI, what isn't AI, what's the difference between AI and automation. So just some brief introductions of our panelists. We have an incredible lineup of AI innovators in this space. So first we're joined by Shawn Manchester, CEO of Triplebar. Triplebar's approach combines cutting-edge bioengineering, such as microfluidics, with AI to test millions of molecules in the time it would usually take to explore just 1,000. Next, we have Som Ganchoudhuri, who's honored as one of the top 50 innovators at the World Innovation Congress. He is the founder of AI Palette, using AI to empower CPG companies with real-time consumer trends and insights. I think we'll touch on that quite a bit, given the conversations that we've had yesterday. And last but not least, Monchinski, CTO of InflexionPoint. Chris and InflexionPoint are addressing the complications of scaling in the cultivated meat industry through their Nexalis platform, and we'll talk a lot about that today. And before we really begin with questions and diving in, I wanted to just pose a couple quick questions to the audience. So first, who has used AI or who maybe uses AI at work? By a show of hands, yes. So a little, maybe half. I was expecting actually a bit more. I will ask the exact same question, but the question is now, who's using AI at work that is not ChatGPT? Okay, a little less. And then who in this audience would feel comfortable really just describing AI, what is AI to a person on the street? Much less. Okay, wonderful. So this should be a really insightful conversation then. So to open up and kick things off, I first just go to the panelists. Could you kind of briefly describe yourself, your own background, and how you use AI? And if you could, explain what is AI and what also isn't AI in your perspective.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Shawn Manchester here. So I'm a chemical engineer by training, and I've been in the industrial biotech space now for over 10 years. I think I'm really excited for this conversation because I think AI has a lot of promise and, of course, can be incredibly powerful. But it's also controversial, so it's a great topic for a panel, and hope to get some of your voices in here as well. I think, what AI is. I think AI is not one thing. That's like the most important thing that I would want to say. At Triplebar, we're particularly interested in generative AI to design organisms and molecules, proteins, that have a particular kind of function, whether that's a cell line that grows in suspension for cultivated meat or an antibody that cures a disease, something like cancer. And so that's the kind of AI that we work on, and of course to do that you need incredibly large data sets, which we're able to generate with our platform. I would say what AI isn't. AI is not a magic bullet. And I think that that's an important thing for us all to speak about as we speak about this topic. It's become very trendy. There's a lot of investment in companies if they use the word AI in their pitch, and I think that does a disservice to the idea. It's an engineering discipline like any other, and it's specifically useful in certain cases. I'll also say I've been struck by kind of the extent to which we've talked about kind of flavor in food, and I've been thinking about how food is really about culture, and it's about tradition as well. And so I think we should all be careful to include the concept of AI, something that people are already kind of scared about, in cultivated meat, which doesn't really need any additional kind of detractors from a kind of public perception perspective. So that's one thing I'll add.
Well, thanks everyone for being here and sitting with us on this. Like Shawn, when we got the title for the topic and the talk here, I was very excited to be part of this because I'm CTO at InflexionPoint. InflexionPoint has done business as Automated Control Concepts in the past. Now we're known as InflexionPoint. We've been in business 40 years, and we've been in the automation business in food and bev, and also in pharma and life sciences for those 40 years. And I've worked with InflexionPoint for 29 of those 40 years. So we've been around for a little while. As was mentioned, we have a platform that we've built now, taking advantage of technologies that we have today in the cloud, et cetera, in order to get access to lots of data and be able to use AI in order to build out new insights and analysis in that manufacturing space. So a little different from what Shawn was talking about, and where you talk about model-based AI and trying to build almost digital twins essentially that can help you gain new insight into new formulations, new cell lines, et cetera. I'm very much focused on the manufacturing space and how you can scale manufacturing, how you can use this data to more readily reproduce the same quality results that you want to get. The cultured meat and cellular and bioreaction processes in general are very complex. Right? A lot of variables that are involved. There's a lot of analysis and time-consuming work that's done in monitoring the real-time data sets over multiple days and these reactions. If we can take advantage of the data that we already have from a lot of the automation and apply AI to it, we can simplify that, make it more repeatable, make it scalable. That's what we're after.
Hello everyone, I'm Som, the co-founder and CEO of AI Palette, coming from Singapore, the first country which approved cultured meat in December 2020. At AI Palette, we help the food and beverage companies with the new product innovation by understanding the consumers and really tell them what kind of products they should launch in the market so that it is successful. So the part that we play here is to really understand the consumer needs and then create the product around it. So from my point of view, the difference between automation and AI is pretty simple. Automation is where you have some predefined logics and sets, and basis that the whole system runs. So for example, it could be for industrial automation, where you know that if the pressure reaches a certain level, then a valve should open. So, and it does and repeats the same thing again and again. When it comes to artificial intelligence, it's about it not just does what is asked to do, it learns over a period of time so that it gets better. For example, we use natural language processing to understand what the consumers are really interested in. And there, a big part goes into understanding how people describe food, what is really important to them. And that's where the algorithm gets better over and over repeated usage.
Great. Thank you guys for that introduction. And to kind of still keep it high level, just wanted to know, with the rise of AI, what are the most significant opportunities that you're seeing in this space, in the cultivated meat space, and what are the challenges specifically that we're trying to overcome with AI and automation?
Okay. Yeah, since I have the mic, I'll go first. Yeah. So one of the big advantages that we have here is to really understand what the consumers are really interested in. It could be in terms of the format, flavor, application, recipes, etc. And this is really, really key. So for example, what we saw with the plant-based space was that the first products that were launched into the market were the plant-based burgers and the plant-based nuggets. It made a lot of sense because it's really popular in the US. So after the product was launched into the US, companies figured out, okay, maybe we should next go to China because there is a huge population. Good. Then they went and started selling burgers and nuggets in China. But guess what? They eat, but not as much as they eat here. Same story repeated in Southeast Asia, where you are trying to sell burgers where people really love their noodles and satays and dumplings. So by really understanding the formats, then we know what kind of product formats we need to use the cultured meat that we are creating so that there is more acceptance among the consumers. Same case when it comes to understanding what kind of flavors people like in different markets. Should we look at kimchi or barbecue? And basis that, then we can apply those particular flavors. And finally, what kind of recipes different markets prefer. And basis that, then you can create a marketing campaign of the cultured meat on what recipe the consumers would be using it. And all of these can be done across different markets because different cultures have different preferences for food because of the cultural nuances.
I can take it next year. We'll pass it on down here. Excellent. You know, what's interesting about our panel, too, and our introductions is that you realize that we all come from a slightly different angle here on this, and yet we're talking about the same topic, application of AI. So, you know, where does, where is the opportunity for AI right now? So in the manufacturing space, as I mentioned, before, we know that this is a complex process. Moreover, a lot of us are in a stage right now where we're still scaling, right? And so how many people are buying used bioreactors? How many people are buying used equipment or renting equipment or leasing equipment or working with CDMOs? I met someone here who's actually a CDMO who's qualified to work in cultured meat, okay? So you have a lot of different processes and you want to then replicate the same behavior over and over again and get the same results. The AI, synthesizing all that data, can help us do that. That's a tremendous opportunity that's going to help us to scale. It's going to make it less relevant what kind of equipment we're working on, what specific processes are happening. If we understand the science and we understand what we're looking for, we can then teach the AI to control those processes, all the different variables aside, because the AI can actually crunch that data and provide that insight in near real time. That's a pretty important thing for us to consider. I like to think, we talked about, and someone mentioned briefly, that there's a distinction between AI and automation. You had mentioned that there's the automation, I guess, is the opening of a valve based on a certain condition of pressure, thing like that. That's probably raw automation, I agree. I look at AI as being automation too, to some extent. I think there's less of a difference between the two, because if you see, I often say that the AI is not a black box. It's not doing discovery per se, although your models might be doing something a little bit different there, so that's an interesting, intriguing point. For me, the AI is automating the difficult task of crunching all this data. We have the data, we have the SMEs who understand what the data means, and they're spending all their time sifting through the data, arranging the data, looking at the multidimensional aspect of that data, and then they're, aha, this is the result. Now how do I automate that? How do I turn that around and repeat that in real time consistently over and over again? Well, it's another automation problem. It's just a far more complex problem. And that's the opportunity for AI in manufacturing, in particular for our scale up, for our quality.
So the challenge that we're focused on at Triplebar is how do we engineer biology to do what we want? And that's an incredibly difficult challenge. You know, people have spoken about the various tools, and I think we need all the tools in the toolbox, to be perfectly clear. You know, today we're relying on the natural algorithm for design in biology, which is evolution. It works pretty well. But we're also faced in cultivated meat with one of the biggest challenges, which is how do we take animal cells and make them grow as well as you know, a yeast in a fermenter. It took thousands of years for the humanity to figure out how to brew beer. We don't have thousands of years to wait for us to figure out how to make cultivated meat in those same kind of bioreactors. And so, our platform has a certain throughput. It's incredibly large. We can look at billions of mutations at a time. But importantly, the design space in an animal cell, in the genome of that animal cell, is larger than the size of the number of atoms in the universe. And so, AI is a great way, we think, in the future, once it gets trained to be able to do this, to really narrow down that design space to something that we can actually work with. We're still going to need incredibly high throughput methods, but if we can accelerate that kind of starting point, we think there's a lot of value there.
That's great. I want to keep it with Shawn. So, I mean, now Chris and you have both touched on the data, and whether it's natural language processing or image recognition or any type of AI, I think data is the basic building block. So can you kind of talk more about your system and how you're collecting and maybe optimizing data?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So what we've done at Triplebar is we've miniaturized the test tube so that it is only slightly bigger than a cell. And what that allows us to do is to investigate the performance. Do they grow in suspension? Do they grow quickly? Do they grow to high density? At incredibly high throughput. So we can look at thousands of cells per second, tens of millions per day. That allows us to create an incredible amount of data about the relationship between the genotype of those cells and their particular function in the context of the phenotypes that matter for cultivated meat. And so that becomes a training set, which you could train a generative AI model on, which would help you understand, how to do that faster or better. There are some very important challenges with doing that in cultivated meat. The first is that the sequencing problem is still a real problem. An animal genome is 1 billion base pairs. It's not trivial to sequence millions of those. And then there's also the problem of how do you introduce the designs once you figure out what you'd actually like to do. That brings up both concerns around GMO as well as just actually bioengineering challenges. So lots of work to do here, but I think also an incredible potential.
And so is there sort of a continual learning system that gets built, whereas as you get more training data, your data set gets larger, it gets essentially smarter, and you can kind of get to that rapid iteration more easily, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what we're working on. We've seen this already add benefit in the protein engineering work that we do. And to be clear, we do not believe that there's one model that's going to work for every system. So we might have a model for an antibody that's an agonist against a particular cell surface receptor in a cancer cell. We might have a model for an enzyme that converts a particular substrate to something else. That's not the same model, and it's certainly not the same model that's going to help us design a cell line for cultivated meat.
And then for the others, just kind of same question. Can you share more about how you collect and optimize data for your models?
Yeah, I mean, again, coming from the history and years of working in manufacturing, especially in food and bev, traditional food and bev, the tools to collect the data are there. You look at pretty modern manufacturing today, and we have a lot of data already. In fact, most people will tell you that the manufacturing generates more data than all this other data that we've been talking about, whether it's kiosks and user preferences and social media, et cetera. Manufacturing data is rich. We're not taking full advantage of it. One of the challenges, of course, is that when we're bringing that data together, we're not necessarily contextualizing the data. So before we can apply AI effectively, if we want to spend all our time working on sanitizing the data, that's always the challenge in data science, right? 80% of the effort is sanitizing the data before you can actually apply the algorithm. We really want to contextualize the data. So that's one of the challenges that we're trying to meet right now, is providing that contextualization, that unified namespace for the data, so that when the data is collected nearest its source, it's already being applied with context and then brought into a larger data model, so that you have data not just from your bioreactor, but you have data from your environmental systems. You have data on your media and your media lots. You have data on the full supply chain, essentially. You bring that all into one unified namespace. Now you can consume that data with the AI models. You can train your models more effectively and quickly. They have a lot more context and data to work with. The data is more normalized. You can get to the end game faster. So that's really an important part right now, I think, in the challenge for manufacturing. It's one that you will all see, if you haven't touched it already, as you start to scale up and you say, well, all the other food manufacturers and traditional manufacturers and biotechs, et cetera, in the life sciences arena are already doing all of this. Let's just go follow what they're doing. And I will tell you right now, they're faced with lots of challenges. So we need to get on top of those. We have a tremendous amount of capability, the resources we have today, and we think we can solve the problem. But there's definitely lots of work still to do.
So the data that we collect today, a lot of data comes from the data which is publicly available online, coming from multiple different sources like menus, recipes, e-commerce, social media data. So as you can imagine, lack of data is not a challenge for us. The challenge for us is, how do you separate the noise from the data which is available publicly? And in order to do that, we need to use multiple different types of AI, because the data could be in the form of text, it could be in the form of images, it could be in the form of videos, and sometimes even audios. So in order to ensure that the data that we are analyzing is the right amount of data, the contextualization, which Chris mentioned, is really, really important. So you need to first clean the data and tag the data. In order to do that, we use natural language processing, where it tries to understand the intent of a particular text, is it in relation to food and beverage or not. If it is not in relation to food and beverage, it's not really important for us to remove it out. And doing that is not easy as it sounds, because it could be, because when people are talking about something, most of the time they don't use the right grammar, particularly when it comes to informal conversations on social media. People use short words and other things. So how you can understand and make sense of data where the grammar is not being followed, the spellings are not being followed. So we have to build our own models which can really understand the context of that. Then even more challenges, right? People love to name their pets after food items. They name their dogs Brownie, if it's a brown-colored dog, sometimes Cola. So then you need to use a combination of image analytics and also the text analytics to see, is it in context of food or is it in context of pets? So then you filter that out. Then analyze the images to understand and get more context in terms of like where something is being consumed. Is it a particular type of food product people like to consume on the go or indoor versus outdoor? Is it something they like to consume in a social setting, or is it something they like to consume it alone? So all those different types of analysis becomes really important. And along with the natural language processing and computer vision and image analytics, we also use cross-sectional forecasting. Cross-sectional forecasting is when you just not look into the data, particular piece. I'm not just looking into, say plant-based in isolation. I'm also looking into the other trends around it, or I'm looking into the other countries which influences the other, and basis that making prediction in terms of like what the consumers will like in a particular country.
Just to answer that real quick, because you had mentioned, in adding context, you described your problem space. You talked about using generative AI kind of concepts in order to sanitize that data, to be able to interpret the data and then apply the context to the data as it's coming in raw. Whereas, of course, when I was talking about the data sanitization and contextualization problem space, the way I think of it is that, well, you've got to really build out the systems up front correctly. And then, of course, the data that I'm working with, manufacturing, is a little more controlled, perhaps, because we know where it's coming from. We can define its sources. It's under our control. I think that is another interesting challenge for us, again, in the data, in this space, and you had mentioned it as well, contextualizing the data and doing that data sanitization before you can apply the AI is critically important so that the AI is getting good data and it can actually give you the result you expect. Whether we apply tools that are going to sanitize the data as it comes to us, or whether we can contextualize that data, control that data before and put it into the repositories so that it can be used effectively with the context we expect, is going to be a continued fork and decision point that we'll have to make depending upon the problem space and what data we're looking at, data sets we're working with. So, and again, mentioning the generative AI is very interesting because that's a relatively new phenomena. We think about it, we interact with a chat GPT, but there's places to apply those generative AI concepts for this data sanitization problem. May completely turn this problem space on its head. So it's interesting.
That's actually...
Thanks for adding it.
Thank you. That's actually a good kind of segue into my next question. So yesterday we had heard that, especially like the producers need to be a lot more comfortable not being sort of these full stack companies. But are there any best practices or anything that you recommend, maybe specifically for you, Chris? Like, what does the audience really need to understand about AI and their data tech stack right now before they kind of maybe utilize some of the services that we're talking about?
Yeah, so it's a good point to consider where you're at right now, and there is, and we're up here talking about this, a lot of promise with the data. So what's interesting is, and you had mentioned it too, when you said that the analogy to yeast and beer, and the fact that it took us a millennia, maybe, right, to essentially perfect this process and understand it fully, right? We don't have that opportunity in this cultured meat industry, but at the same time, we're at a tremendous point in our history as a community because we have all this computing horsepower at our hands. We have all this science and understanding now of artificial intelligence, machine learning algorithms, et cetera. We can apply these. So we should be savvy and cognizant of the fact that this is a tool and a set of tools in our toolbox that we can use and apply to help us scale very quickly. That said, though, things to be aware of, too. You had mentioned it as well, I think, Shawn, it's not a black box. I often think, especially in the manufacturing arena, I talk about thematically that AI, as I mentioned, is a new form of automation to me. And the reality is you're going to need all of you, the scientists, the SMEs that understand the process, understand how to optimize that process to be able to tame the AI and apply it because it's going to be a tool for you basically to repeat processes and gain better efficiency, more scale, et cetera. It's not necessarily going to, like I said, at least from my point of view, it's not necessarily going to be a black box that just gives you magical insight. Of course, another way to apply AI is to build base models first, and then when those models become complex enough, use data sets against those models essentially to see how they behave. That can yield new insights. So there's a couple different ways you can apply the tool as well. Absolutely. You want to answer that?
I'll just add one thing here. I think the data that you all are generating in the course of the work that you're doing is going to be incredibly valuable, right? Potentially to you, potentially to the industry. And so I would recommend that you spend just a little bit of time thinking about how are you capturing it and storing it in a way that preserves the kind of metadata or the context associated with it. We don't know exactly how different this field is going to evolve and what kind of data will be useful in the future. And so starting now, collecting it in a way that would make it maximally useful, I think is definitely valuable.
Yeah, I'll just say one more thing about that too. I think I heard someone yesterday, I was talking out in the booth there, say that, well, they're not really paying attention or looking at their data yet, that it's too early for them. It's never too early. Everything that you do, every point of data that you generate is valuable to you. That data is, I know everyone said the data is the new gold, right? But it really is true to some extent that especially in this space, all the complexities of the things that we're trying to accomplish, we should recognize the fact that that data is critically important. We should be collecting it in some form or fashion. We don't know where we might use it. That doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't be looking at that and looking at our data position and how we collect that data, store that data.
Yeah, and just to add here, so the great opportunity here is that the industry is very nascent, the companies are very young. So, we all can go AI first here. So there are no baggages of the old companies. So when you try to work with the old companies, they have already set ways of doing things. Then they're trying to figure out how they can fit in AI change the things, change the mindset of people, which a lot of time becomes a big challenge. I think here we can go start with AI from day zero.
Yeah, if I could just add, yeah, that's a great point as well, too, that if you think about it, because the industry is somewhat small, because a lot of us are not full-scale manufacturing yet with dozens of plants, et cetera, and a complex supply chain, we have the opportunity to take advantage of this technology, cloud-based tools, new types of data collection to make our manufacturing footprint far more nimble, to make it far more cost-effective, to take advantage of this and get this data, and then use this data again. So we have an opportunity really to tear a new page in the book and basically start fresh. That's tremendous. Not very often do we get an opportunity like that, especially collectively as an industry.
That's great. So with all this promise, there are maybe potential pitfalls, though, right, and challenges. So Shawn, you mentioned maybe on the consumer perception side, how we talk about AI in our food industry might be a risk, but are there any other kind of risk or pitfalls that you folks see that we should all be aware of?
I mean, I think one that's worth considering is just understanding the amount of data that's going to be required to use AI to solve a particular problem. I think when I was at Zymergen a while ago, and we were trying to use generative AI to solve the kind of microbial strain design problem. And we were doing that with data that was generated by liquid handling robotics or automation, which kind of allows you to generate thousands of data points. And then trying to train a genome-wide model based on thousands of data points, it didn't really add a lot of value, right? So I was kind of head-to-head with that model, and I was just as good at it, and I'm not a great metabolic engineer, so not that useful. The point being that I think once you understand what's the amount of data that's really going to be required, then you can ask the question, okay, is it worth trying to deploy AI in this context or not? Underestimating the amount of data required will mean that you'll spend a lot of time and effort trying to deploy something that's going to add very little value.
Yeah, I would say, and you touched on it a little bit too, when you mentioned you didn't have the particular expertise, but the reality is, again, make sure your data teams, you call it a data team, these are not siloed individuals. Don't just hire a bunch of data scientists, expect them to build you AI models. You are the SMEs, you're the experts. You know what business problems you're trying to solve, what manufacturing challenges you're trying to solve. So make sure that your team is a collective, essentially, and that the SMEs, the people who are really driving the business case, the value proposition to your organizations, are at the table throughout the entire process. Yeah, someone needs to understand and pick a technology. Yeah, someone needs to understand how to build that model, essentially, and understand the difference between maybe an anomaly detection and a correlation, et cetera. Okay, there's data science there, but there's a lot of products out there, and this is becoming a much more productized marketplace, which means that we can do a lot with, as they say, low code, no code. We don't necessarily need to staff ourselves up with a lot of data science people. What we really need to do is appreciate the fact that we, in our heads, all have the understanding. We just need to now use the AI to automate that and make that more repeatable so that we can scale.
Yeah, and just to add on to it, I think one of the other challenges is when it comes to the availability of the data on which the model can be trained on. And one of the things that I saw was like a lot of food and beverage companies, they're interested in using AI when it comes to formulation and recipe generation. Now, in order to do that, you need a lot of data. So you ask the big companies, yeah, we have thousands of recipes. But when you actually go through the recipes, different people have created recipes in different ways. So ultimately, if you look into the percent of recipes on which you can train the model to create recipes, it's really, really small. And then you ask the question, okay, are you okay to share the recipes, or you can talk to multiple companies who come together and share the recipes? And basis that you build a model for the whole industry. Guess what? Nobody is interested in doing that because there's like confidentiality and IP involved. So again, the challenge remains the quality of the data, and that's where the opportunity is for a new industry like that if we are able to track the data and store them in the right way from day one.
So I might switch gears here and kind of stay with you. Yesterday we heard a lot about, taste is pretty much king, and AI palette can specifically be on both like the downstream and upstream side of the equation, right? Should you take consumer trends and insights into advantage before you're building out your products in the market, or there's you mentioned like a 1 to 2 year gap in some of the consumer trends, and it takes so long to get a product actually to market. Now you might have to pivot on the marketing, the branding, the packaging, et cetera. So can you just kind of talk to that and share maybe an example where you've seen some consumer trends or insights that should be informing some of the audience here when they're building out product?
Sure. So the consumer is really key when we are building a product. So using AI, you can not just identify the trends, but also you can go a few steps further in terms of like, okay, I have identified a trend. Now what kind of product I should be creating, what kind of concept I should be creating. And when you create a product concept, we have a solution, Food GPT. What it does is that because it's trained on consumer data, it uses the words and the descriptors which will resonate better with the consumers. For example, when it comes to the plant-based, should you use the word plant-based or should you use the word vegan? And the choice of word makes a lot of difference. So creating a concept for the new opportunity that I've identified, and then immediately figure out, along with the 15 or 20 different ideas that you might have created, which concept will have higher chances of working in the market. So this three-step process of identifying trends, creating concepts, and finally validating the concept in a traditional classical research take on an average 6 months, if not more. So this whole time of 6 months can be cut down into a few clicks using the power of AI. And to share an example in terms of like, let me share a real example. So it's not in cultivated meat because there are not many companies which have launched products in cultivated meat. So this is in the field of alternative dairy. So this was a pretty large company who were thinking about launching plant-based yogurt in one of the Southeast Asian markets. So they're very bullish about it. So the question was whether they should do it or not, because it would mean a lot of investment at their end by producing the product in the local country, marketing it and selling it. So when they looked through the data that we have, it was pretty clear that plant-based yogurt, it's very, in its infancy, it's very dormant. The prediction is not very bullish about that particular trend. So then the management made a decision, okay, we'll not focus on plant-based yogurt, instead we'll keep on focusing on plant-based milk. And that was 2 years back. And guess what? 2 years from now, plant-based yogurt is still non-existent in that particular country. And they are doing pretty good with their plant-based milk investment.
And for the other panelists, just a chance to respond to maybe some of the discussion yesterday on, taste versus texture versus all these things. And is there any way we can take AI into account besides on the consumer trends or insights? Do you have any other thoughts there?
Well, yeah, I mean, I talk about, and I've been talking about kind of the traditional manufacturing process, the bioreactor essentially, and your dissolved oxygen reading and your pH and your media lot changes. But there's a whole downstream part of this too, a quality aspect of measuring and quantifying things such as texture, taste, flavor, doing a decomposition or destructive analysis of the end product, and then looking at that quality, whether it's sampling or whatnot, when you collect that data, then feeding that back. And how do I reproduce that process? How do I get, this was a really good batch of product. It had the right umami flavor, et cetera. This is the profile I want. There's a lot of variables that go into that profile, and again, it goes all the way back up into the manufacturing itself. How do I then reproduce that? What are all the metrics and data that I need to do that? There's a lot of data that you'll need. There's a lot throughout the entire process to analyze that, and you don't necessarily know which data points, you may have an idea, and again, we're the SMEs again, but we don't want to be caught short not having the data that we need once we understand this is the data I need in order to control this profile better, in order to be able to reproduce this on a regular basis. So that's a pretty important part of that, and I think that there was some really good points made in Dylan's presentation yesterday about the importance of understanding that profile. You're looking at it from a consumer product perspective. I'm looking at it from, okay, now I know what the consumer wants and we've solved that problem. That would be a good problem to solve. And now how do I scale again and manufacture what the consumer really wants from me? There's another presentation yesterday that talked about where we might end up in the supply chain, that maybe we're not making our own independent product completely from cultivated meat, but it's a blend. I think it was maybe Dylan's presentation as well, where we talked about whether it's a blend of plant-based and cultivated meat or real meat and cultivated meat. So again, understanding that blend profile is going to be consumer data to some extent. They're going to drive it, right? The acceptance of it, and also where we fit in the supply chain. And then again, how we optimize our manufacturing process to meet that supply chain challenge, which is going to go back to the manufacturing again. So it's going to be a blend of a lot of different data sets and a lot of different tugs from different directions that are going to inform us. And AI is going to be an important tool that we use throughout that process.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Chris. I think flavor is an amazing place where AI can be applied to help us understand what contributes to something that actually tastes good. I think we don't really understand flavor as a science, right? And so that whenever we lack a good rational understanding for something, there's the potential for AI, given the right data set, to help us figure that out. So I think it's a really interesting point. Another thing that I'll just add is I was looking at the AI generated images in the room here and thinking about this model Midjourney. And kind of the cultural feel of Midjourney in the context of those images felt to me to be pretty Blade Runner. And I don't know if you guys remember the movie Blade Runner, but the food is not good. And so I just think it's really interesting as we think about how can we use AI to help us get the right cultural note, the right kind of emotional vibe around what we're trying to do, and to make sure that's really tuned to kind of how people think about food and how people want to consume food, as opposed to this kind of bland, futuristic one, which is probably not the right look for us.
You made a great point.
Less cyberpunk, more biopunk.
Early on, when you were talking earlier, Shawn, you talked about how food is cultural, right? There's a personal, a visceral feeling about it, right? And so you're absolutely right. It's like getting the right vibe for how we present this is going to be pretty important. And I'll just say that when we were talking backstage about the Midjourney photos, multiple ones of us had this thought about that's Blade Runner. So I kind of wonder what Midjourney's been fed and how it's been biased too. Perhaps that's another pitfall, going back to your earlier question, to think about when we use AI models and when we do data, especially when we're talking about consuming and using data from external sources, because I had someone ask me about that earlier. We have to understand the context of where that data came from, because we don't want a biased output. Again, the AI is really not, it's artificial intelligence. It's not going to think and consider and juxtapose all the different facts for us. It's going to tell us about what it knows. ChatGPT is a great example of that, because it always prefaces things by saying, I've only been trained up to data in 2021. Right, we know that, right? So you always see that disclaimer in certain aspects when it might not know how to answer a question that it knows is something newer than what it's been trained on.
We have to be aware of the bias in our own data, and then also I feel like AI is really meant to augment human intelligence, right, and help us discern things. Or you're training it to discern as if a human would. So if you have bias in the data, it's going to have bias just like we all have, right? So kind of moving on to, I was curious what your thoughts on other enabling technologies, kind of aside from AI, that are going to be very important. We've talked about cloud technologies and these kind of things, but what are the other enabling technologies that you think we should all be aware of and that you think there's a bright future for, that are going to help us kind of continue on this kind of exponential growth that AI promises?
Other enabling technologies, yeah. So certainly, again, from just a rapid deployment point of view, cloud-based technologies, the ability to spin up, the term they use in the cloud is elastic resources, because a lot of times with AI, you don't want to necessarily deploy or build out a bunch of infrastructure. It's a tool again, so you use it, you have these elastic resources, you can deploy resources on demand, and then you can scale them back. So that it becomes cost effective to be able to get the resources you need to do your simulations, do your training of your model, and then essentially, for example, in our instance, we'll train our ML models on cloud-based resources because we're dealing with large volumes of data. But once we're satisfied that ML model is trained, we'll deploy it on-prem, essentially. We'll deploy it running next to the bioreactor, feeding from data that it's reading from that bioreactor process directly. And so it's a very small deployment now. And it doesn't necessarily need to be connected to the cloud. In fact, connecting it back to the cloud, especially if it's an intermittent connection, or letting it continue to train on the data it's seeing from the actual bioreaction process, can sometimes make it deviate or shift from the actual desired solution. So it's the technology, the ability to use the cloud but use it elastically is going to be very important for us.
I think another important thing that we all need to consider is that we're likely going to need novel bioreactor designs, not to do the first step, right, which is just biomass generation, but to the second step, which is to differentiate that biomass into tissue that's actually interesting to eat. And so I think there's an incredible amount of advancement that needs to happen, and I hope that advancement happens in a way that's also kind of relatively open so that all companies can take advantage of it. Because I just think it's a brand new aspect of engineering at scale, and that's pretty cool.
And it's quite possible that AI will help facilitate the new bioreactor designs and the what-if questions that we would like to throw out there, and be able to do that in a simulated environment more rapidly, so that we can, rather than building prototypes, we'll ultimately have to do that, but basically looking for all the failures fast and then getting to the prototype stage and the actual production stage much quicker with the designs that will actually facilitate that. Yeah, absolutely.
And the one technology I'm most excited about is the bite-sized LLM. So the large language models, right now it's pretty large. So you have an information, you send it to the server, and you get the results. So bite-sized LLMs can be installed even on your eyeglasses. So for example, you are inside mines, or there's no signal. You can look into the picture and do the analysis directly in your eyeglasses, and it feeds you like what's there. Or if you're doing deep sea diving, you're still able to use it. So that will bring in a lot of advancement.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Are there any advances? Is quantum going to be relevant to this? This is a trend that I'm seeing more and more, just in the general VC space that people are paying attention to.
Well, I guess, again, when I talk about cloud-based elasticity is what we have today, right? So, but think about what's NVIDIA, right? Is the stock of the day, right? And the reason is because they had the GPU chips, which are graphical chips, okay? But they're being repurposed now to use on AI because they need that kind of numeric computational horsepower, right? So imagine now quantum computing at scale, okay, provides us yet another ability to do very fast numeric number crunching, multiple parallel data sets. Yeah, absolutely. I don't think it's near term. I think it's more futuristic because there's a lot of difficulties, as I understand it, with implementing quantum computing both at scale, the number of parallel processes and sizes, and also at room temperature, as I understand it, right? So that's another challenge for us. But the reality is, yeah, absolutely, be on lookout for new types of compute power and parallel computer capability that will help to be able to dissect this data and get at the root very quickly. Absolutely.
Awesome. So we'll start to sort of wind down and get ready for audience questions in about 5 or 10 minutes. So I guess just to sort of start the end of the panel, what's one key takeaway that you want the audience to remember from this session, or what should they go out and maybe study after this session?
I would think, let's summarize in one key takeaway that AI is here and now. It's not a 2035 solution. It's not something that you should put off and not consider. Make sure you understand what's out there and available for you now. Get your data house in order, and don't neglect that. And AI can be applied for a lot of different use cases in this industry, as we've all pointed out, across the spectrum, from research and development through scale-up and manufacturing to full supply chain integration and feedback and information sets that will come from our consumers and information that's coming from all directions in our organization. We have a tremendous opportunity here. This is here and now. Take advantage of it. Learn about it. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll just say, AI is not one thing, it's many things, and each of those things requires a different amount and quality of data, and so make sure that you're matching those two things well.
So AI will solve a lot of problems, but we need to keep in mind that this is not the silver bullet. This is not the solution to each and every problem. The expectations are very high, but at the same time, when you're implementing AI, keep in mind that there will be learning time, there will be a training time, and it cannot solve all your problems.
Yeah, so to wrap it up, looking to the future, how do you sort of envision the landscape specifically in the cultivated meat industry by, let's say, 2030? And what role has AI played in that future scenario?
I do think that as companies perfect processes and understand how they're going to fit into the supply chain, they will need to scale up manufacturing, and they will partner with manufacturing companies, and there'll be a sharing of technology, even new bioreactor designs, et cetera, or new downstream equipment designs. As a result, you'll be working and partnering more, and you won't go through the process, I don't believe, that's happened within, let's say, pharma, where they built out their own manufacturing capacity and then realized they had overcapacity, or that capacity only had a 20-year lifespan, and then they had to change, and now, of course, they're fragmenting into the CDMO space, right? That's what Cell and Gene is doing right now for patient of one design on life sciences side. I think that you'll follow a similar pattern. AI will be very important for knowledge transfer, being able to understand and replicate processes across different manufacturing partners that you'll have in your network. That'll be very important.
I mean, 2030 is pretty soon. It's almost 2024, so I imagine that we'll be using AI to do kind of better process control. I imagine that we will be using AI to potentially think about flavors. I hope so. I think that's pretty interesting. I'm not sure we'll be using AI to do kind of whole organism design yet, to be perfectly honest. But I hope at some point in the future we will. And I think, outside of just AI, I hope that by 2030 we've matured this industry sufficiently that we have kind of, a horizontal stack of various companies, each of which focuses on the things that they do well. And together we can kind of increase the volume and the quality of products that flow through that supply chain and are able to get to customers. I think we see this across industries when they mature. And so my hope is that that actually happens very quickly. And I don't know exactly how AI will play a role in that, but I think it's something we all have to make happen.
And maybe it's a good chance to expand on a thought we discussed earlier, right? In some cases, we've seen AI's advance quite a lot in the last 5 or 10 years, but in some cases, you said, we're still on day one in a lot of these areas. What are some of those areas, and then what's the kind of the horizon you see for them? And the impact?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, obviously, large language models kind of burst onto the scene, and now you can talk to a computer and have it, seem like it's a human. I think the stuff that's still on day one is whole organism design with AI. And so I think that we have a long way to go there. It's very hard to predict things that are far out in the future. I know people continuously underestimate the amount of things that get done in 10 years, and I'm doing that, I'm sure. So.
This is true, and when I talk about the scale of manufacturing and the point that I was making earlier, I think it was Rika Tron yesterday who was on a panel here who made the point that it's a little frustrating where we are right now in this industry, and that some companies seem to feel they have to do the heavy lift, they have to do everything. One of the challenges is media, as an example, right? There's the media companies right now are geared towards the life science companies. There's a different price point there. How do we get media that's food grade, but how do we do that repeatably with the high level of quality and at scale? So AI will definitely play a part in that, in helping us to build out, again, where we all fit in the supply chain and a nice ecosystem of companies that can support this industry.
Consumers want more choices. They want to see more varieties on their plate. So I'm not sure whether it will be possible by 2030, but in the future, I would like to see more and more option when it comes to meat. Maybe ostrich meat, maybe kangaroo meat. Maybe I would like to eat a mammoth burger sometime into the future.
That's awesome. So we'd love to kind of open this up to the audience now. Any questions around AI? We should have some mic runners here. There's quite a few hands up.
Shawn and Shawn and Chris, you mentioned that AI could be used for novel bioreactor development to scale cultured meat. Can you guys expand on that?
Well, absolutely. If you understand if you can model the chemical processes, and as Shawn has pointed out, if you can model the cellular processes, right? I think it was mentioned actually yesterday in one of the panel discussions as well, is that we're designing and we're growing these cells in bioreactors. They're meant to grow evolutionarily in the human body, or in the case of life sciences, or in an animal's body. And now we have this manufacturing process where we're trying to basically replicate those processes and get these cells to grow properly. I think that modeling these processes and modeling the interaction of this, and have good models on the cells, and modeling their interaction with the process variables will help us design to lead to different types of designs in bioreactors, either shape or the way we manage media, and also, quite frankly, the way that we actually implement our data collection out of those systems, whether it's inline or at-line data collection.
I think I was just saying, I think it's a challenge we need to solve. I don't know exactly how to apply AI in that context, but I think it's an innovation the industry needs.
Very interesting topic. I work a lot with Gen AI and other machine learning technologies. What do you think is the sort of most near-term applicable thing for generative AI? And I like to separate that from what we're kind of generally calling AI here, as in a machine learned model that actually creates something new. So what do you think is most applicable right now to the cultured meat space?
I mean, so we've worked with generative AI models to design better proteins with function. And so I think that's here today, and I think there are a number of companies working on that. I think it's an open question how you'd apply that to cultivated meat, but I think that is an example of a place where AI is already allowing us to engineer biology better, and specifically generative AI.
I would say one of the challenges for this industry, it's already a challenge for life sciences, is the regulatory compliance. So actually bringing together the synthesis of known data on how to submit compliance and how to do submissions to will be the USDA, FDA in the United States will be incredibly important application for generative AI. There's a lot of data, textualized data there, and a lot of known data that can be brought into a generative AI model in order to produce accurate results. That's definitely one place I see that applied right now.
And the final application would be when you're trying to commercialize and sell it to the consumers, what kind of words and how you should position it. Should we really call it hybrid or should we call it something else? That's really, really key because ultimately they have to buy the product and then only the whole industry will survive.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. One in the back.
It's a great question, and I think it's a critical problem to solve. You know, people want to hold on to their data because they're realizing it's valuable, and I think we need to figure out a way to democratize that and make all the data that we're all generating available to all of us to learn from. So I don't have a good answer to your question, but I thank you for bringing it up, and we all as a community should come up with something.
Completely unrelated, but I'll tell this story from last week. I was at a different symposium where we were bringing together owner-operators in the oil and gas industry with suppliers, et cetera, and talking about sharing of data. Same challenges, proprietary algorithms, proprietary manufacturing processes. We don't want to share our data, especially in an industry like this where everybody's generating this for the first time and they have something novel. Some ways to do that. We actually had that meeting hosted by Texas A&M, and they have a program, and they're going to put academic resources behind building out data sets and basically normalizing that data for exchange, and they're going to make that public. So I think that the universities play a big role here too. I think Tufts is here as well, talking about how they're putting money behind actually generating data and generating information, doing research in cultivated meat. They're going to make that publicly available. If they can help us make publicly available models that we can share information, collaborate with, that might be a great way to have a neutral party help the industry do that.
One option could be synthetic data, but to create the synthetic data, do we have enough data? That's a question.
And I think this will be our last question. Yeah, Alex is in the back.
Hi, thank you all very much for your presentations. This has been really interesting. As a former regulator, one of the points, and again, to echo some points that Kimberly made in her very excellent presentation just before this. I think one of the things we need to be very careful about is the distinction between need to know and nice to know. And one of the difficulty, so I built a new group. We looked at genetically engineered animals and developed policy and how to do that. And there were 1,000,001 questions that regulators have about, oh, this is so cool, and how do we do this, and what about this, and what about that? You don't need to know all those things. Those are things that are nice to know. But what are the key questions that need to be asked with respect to safety, manufacturing, compliance, and so forth and so on? So I'd like to know how you're thinking about distinguishing between need to know and nice to know, because I think there's a need for research in these areas, but there's a difference between a research program and a regulatory program.
I was going to say, for all the years that I've worked in life sciences, this is also another challenge in this arena, in that the data that needs to be presented for regulatory compliance or an inspection by the FDA versus the data that you need and how you segregate that data for your research and development, or driving manufacturing improvements, et cetera. So there's this GMP data and non-GMP data, they call it. In general, the concept that is emerging right now, I think, and again, it's a complex problem, it's not simple to solve, is the unified namespace. The idea that your data points, an asset, for example, a calibrated meter in your manufacturing environment, has multiple dimensions of data associated with it. You need to model those multiple dimensions, whether they be how it's used, how that asset is represented from a calibration and a maintenance perspective or an operational perspective, or a regulatory and non-regulatory dimension of that data. And we need to be cognizant of the fact that our model for that data is going to be pretty complex. That's why we need to unify it and imply that, and think about that context up front, because ultimately we want to be able to easily segregate the data that's important from a regulatory and a safety perspective, from the data that's necessary for research and development, for example, from the data that's proprietary and we want to make sure is governed properly so that we don't give away trade secrets, to the data that we want to share publicly, right? And we just talked about that question before. Lots of different dimensions to this data. It's not a simple problem to solve, but there are lots of good concepts and people talking about how we can do it. So definitely another new thing that's on the horizon. Continue that dialogue, absolutely, and challenge all of us in this industry to continue to think about those things.
I think it's pretty clear when it comes to genetic engineering, the kind of current regulatory framework gets what's need to know versus what's nice to know wrong, right? So, trans genes are kind of need to know as per the regulatory agency, whereas kind of randomly occurring mutations might be a nice to know. Obviously, we all know that a trans gene can be perfectly safe and a randomly occurring mutation could not be. And so I think we need to update our regulatory process to have a good, clear definition of what safety is and how do you ensure it, and not get stuck in these definitions of trans or cis or any other of the silly things that end up in the, and that's worth thinking about, right? I mean, yeah, it's going to hold us back until we do.
All right, thank you. Please give a round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll pass it back to Alex. I think we're just on time for lunch, yes?
That's right. Thank you very much. Let's give it another round of applause. Thank you.